basics on giving students feedback, and then there will be a second video specifically for giving student feedback using alternate technologies, not just kind of on paper written notes. So this first video is kind of like what are the best practices, the short version best practices of giving student feedback. First, there are two types of feedback you can give: formative and summative assessments or feedback. Formative assessment is in the process of the assignment before the final draft or the final project, whatever type of project it is due. That's formative assessment is along the way to change the end, and it is not necessary, and it's not necessarily product based where you're scoring based on what they're actually producing. Formative assessment or feedback is when you give them a response to and give them guidance on how to continue with that project. Summative feedback is often at the end, involves a grade, a final letter grade or score or some sort of thing, and should be approached differently because it's at a different point in the writing process. And so with formative assessment, you can look for things that they can change or consider for that specific project, things they might consider as they move forward from draft to draft to draft. Summative assessment, sometimes people kind of make a mistake on because they will sometimes do a bunch of inline feedback as part of a summative assessment. And that's not going to carry, research says that doesn't really carry through from assignment to assignment to assignment. It might give them an idea of how to clean up that project, but that's something better to do in an almost final draft. So with the summative assessment, it's better to look for patterns of the writer and what kinds of things as they approach the next project might be beneficial. So formative is along the way, usually doesn't have like a product-based assessment tied to it, though it can. It tends to be less effective. And then summative assessment is product-oriented. What did they actually produce? What can I see? And then what are the big patterns that I want to give them feedback on as they approach the next assignment? Not necessarily inline or sentence level stuff necessarily, but it's still an option. We'll talk about that in a minute. Then we have descriptive versus prescriptive feedback. Descriptive feedback is where I'm saying what I'm seeing in the student's writing, I'm describing it, or whoever I'm giving feedback to. Obviously, students is the primary thing if I'm talking to teachers. But I'm giving descriptives of what is it that I see, what's the pattern, what are the things that might need to be addressed, but I'm framing it from a standpoint of here's what I'm discovering, and that's different than prescriptive feedback. You need to fix this. So to make something, so prescriptive feedback is only recommended if it's an egregious concern of yours, and you're going to, what you say in the class and what you communicate to students will determine what they should be focusing on, what you care about for that project. And so if there's a very specific thing they're supposed to be doing, you might need to be prescriptive about that. If it's an early draft, you may hold back on being prescriptive and focus on being descriptive of what they do have and what they have produced. If it's an early draft, everything still might be still muddy for them or still molten and still in formation, so you don't want to spend a lot of time telling them do this, do this, do this, do this, or research shows that takes over the project and the teacher ends up creating the project and the student doesn't get that agency along the way. Descriptive feedback may also be probing questions and setting up ways of asking about what they mean, asking for clarification, asking beyond yes/no questions. So asking whys and hows or what makes you think this type questions, and those tend to push a reader to. It gives them an exigency to respond to, and this can be really effective for students who are struggling with writer's block or struggling to get moving on the writing or producing more word count, giving them a series of questions based on what they've actually dug into. So there's that. So with formative or summative, descriptive and prescriptive, they have their place and they have their purpose. You want to be careful and intentional about which ones you use. When it comes to any feedback, it all comes down to building rapport and relationship. What this means is your response to their work is how they get to know you. A lot of students have internalized a very critical voice from past instructors. So we want to make sure that we are using feedback as a form of relationship building and rapport building with the students, and that ends up becoming more important sometimes than what you actually correct or what you actually give guidance on in their writing, what actual feedback you give. So that's sometimes why timeliness can be important, and this is something I struggle with when it comes to timeliness. And it's the process of trying to get better at it myself that made me push into this area. But realizing that when I get a student a response quickly, they get a sense that I care about them. No matter what the feedback is, having a prompt response and saying something that clearly shows I read the paper and I gave a specific detail, not just kind of cookie cutter feedback, builds that relationship. And even if I have kind of a set of things, like I know I'm going to say something about the thesis, or I know I've got this kind of generic statement about introductory clauses or transitional phrases, whatever it is, or how to use sources. Even if I've got that, I may paste that in, or I may kind of go with a generic thing and then add in your paper, specifically in paragraph 2, this is where I see this happening. That sometimes it personalizes and can make the feedback, so kind of blending those systems can make the feedback go faster for you, but also really build that relationship, build that rapport. And obviously, if you're teaching online for the first time or things like that, giving yourself as a teacher a little bit of flexibility and on when you give feedback is important, because you're adjusting as much as the students are. But there is that thing to consider, and sometimes that can motivate us as teachers to say it's going to make them enjoy the class more, or feel wanted in the class, or get buy-in for the class. I'm going to develop ethos or credibility for and connect with them because I'm timely with feedback and I'm meaningful with it. Okay, so then we've got inline feedback versus summary paragraphs, and this is true no matter what modality or technology you're using. You can spend a lot of time, teachers spend a lot of time in inline feedback. When I do it, if I'm not paying attention, I can take 30, 45 minutes to an hour. I actually spent an hour and a half on papers in my first year teaching, and I'm like, this can't work, because I did that for the first 3-4 papers. I'm like, no, I was just so excited. But you can do inline feedback that's very detailed, very particular, and that, however, is not always the best practice. It can be a big time suck. If it's done at the wrong part of the writing process, it can actually throw the writer off, or not be meaningful to the writer because they're not going to go back and revise unless you necessarily. So usually what I do when it comes to inline feedback, if I'm going to give inline feedback, I will usually do it when we're at about the 70 to 90% part of the project, where they've formed their ideas, they're really starting to get past some of the content development and really starting to fine-tune things. That's when I'll get in and maybe give a little bit of inline feedback. But I've found that I can either spend 20 or 30 minutes on inline feedback, or I can spend in a single sitting on like draft 3 or 4 when we're close to the end, or I can give 2 sets of 5 or 10 minute feedback to build a summary paragraph, which is looking at the big patterns of the writer and not the nuanced sentence level fine tuning. That's something that students, that if you see a pattern of sentence level thing that you want them to deal with, mention it as the pattern and give an example, and then say look through the rest. But sometimes that becomes more meaningful because now you have 2 or even 3 possible touch points in a short paragraph across 2-3 weeks, instead of just that one kind of heavy grading session that you do and detailed grading reading that they're getting. So consider that as you consider what's best, how much inline feedback versus how much summary paragraph to give. And you can also go watch one of my videos on the Rice paragraph model. That's one of the ways I do the summary paragraphs. I start with a relationship and rapport building and complimenting. Then I talk about what do I see, what patterns, then I say whether those patterns are effective or ineffective, and then I explain what might be better ways, or I explain why those are effective things that the person's doing. Remember, feedback also, because it's about relationship, it doesn't have to be only only negative, and a lot of students have this heavy burden of when they get feedback, especially when feedback with a bunch of inline corrections, it ends up being a negative experience for them, and that leads toward that a deeper post-traumatic stress for writing that's long-term. And so, we wonder why people hate writing. That's part of it, is that they get this a lot of fix-it feedback, inline sentence feedback, and there's not really a relationship. So I would encourage you, if you're in the practice of just giving a list of wrongs in paragraph 1, you need to fix this and fix this and fix this, that's not really effective feedback. If you say you're doing this well, doing this well, doing this well, and you should fix this and this, you don't have to highlight every error, because there's errors everywhere, and sometimes highlighting only errors gives a student the wrong impression of what writing is, or what writing should be, or who they are as a writer, and can affect their writer identity. I'm going to talk about audio and video feedback options in the next video, but you don't just have to give paragraph comments. You don't just have to do handwritten inline feedback. You can record audio or video feedback, and we'll talk about some of that in the next video.